quite an intro. So, man, we love numbers, don't we? And I tell you, it's a good thing we do because we have a lot of them. And in the world of the web, we can measure everything we do. And that is generally pretty awesome. But there's times that it actually causes some troubles, like when it leads to kind of incomprehensible spaghetti analysis, or when it gives us confidence that we have no business having. Or sometimes it's just flat out overwhelming. We are drowning in the sea of data. And it's overwhelming sometimes. So today what I want to do is kind of throw out a life preserver and offer some ways that we can take all that data and we can turn that into great analysis. And I find the greatest analysis really kind of has 4 key attributes. It's focused, it's actionable, it's manageable, and it's enlightening. Or for short, fame. I told my son I was going to do that, and he didn't believe me. So fame, is an acronym for all those things, but it's also a place we can kind of go if we present this great analysis. Now, maybe not Hollywood kind of fame, but at the very least, it's sort of, employee of the month parking space kind of fame, and that's not bad. If we can kind of put that together, that is really fantastic. So let's kind of break it down a little bit and talk through that. Focused is the first kind of element that I think is really important. And in focused analysis, we should take our key findings, and those key findings should be succinct and compelling enough that they're kind of like newspaper headlines, Redesign tanks Google conversion. That's going to draw people in, and that's that succinct heading that we want. Now, of course, we're going to have details behind that. That's sort of the story behind the article, and that's good. But we want it to be really focused. We want to spend a lot of time editing, because the reality is we want to take anything that's maybe interesting but not relevant to the key fact and leave that on the cutting room floor. And make sure that that analysis is really focused on those key findings. Very, very important. And next, it's got to be actionable. Any kind of analysis where we present all sorts of information that we can't do anything with is basically useless. So we want it to be actionable. We want something that we can really take and go with. So there should be recommendations in that analysis, and it should be something specific, Recommend redesigning the search landing page to ensure products and features closely match the search terms people are coming in on. That's taking all that data, supporting data, and saying, here's what we should do with it. And that means we can go out and actually execute against the analysis, and that makes it very useful. And then it's got to be manageable. We've got to be able to put a plan to this thing. And so we have to be careful here that we have to, these really great, kind of succinct, compelling findings with all sorts of recommendations, but it's got to be manageable. We can't have so many of them that by the time we execute against them, they're horribly outdated, and we're way sort of behind the times. So I think a good rule of thumb is actually, can we take and summarize our key findings in 30 seconds? That doesn't mean the whole analysis is presented in 30 seconds, but could we take those findings and summarize them in 30 seconds? Could our audience walk away and summarize the analysis we just gave in 30 seconds? Because if it did, we're manageable. We've sort of made that mark. And then finally, it should be enlightening. It should tell us something we didn't know. Ideally, we're kind of in a scenario where people are like, wow, that was amazing. I had no idea. That might be a high mark to achieve, So at the very least, we kind of want someone to kind of go, wow, that makes me think about this issue or this problem or this area of the site in a way that I hadn't before. And if we can do that, then we've really achieved something and we've provided value in the analysis. And so focused, actionable, manageable, enlightening are those key elements that we need in analysis. But the reality is just having those isn't enough. We're going to take that analysis and we're going to present that to a very diverse group of people that have different experience levels, different education levels, different cultural backgrounds even. And they're going to hear this in different ways. We have to be really careful with how we present this, because if we're not careful, then we can end up starting to have all sorts of disconnects and we can lose the whole message. So this cartoon I love, it's like, this guy says, now keep in mind these numbers are only as accurate as the fictitious data, ludicrous assumptions, and wishful thinking they're based upon. And so we have to be careful we don't get into that scenario. And this is where I say, the reality is the success or failure of an analysis is not just on the analyst. It's on the audience too. The entire team plays a role in the success or failure of an analysis. So let me tell you about 11 ways that humans kill good analysis. And some of these will just not, it's done. The very first one is that we hire reporters and not analysts. Now, there's nothing wrong with reporters, and this isn't meant to be any kind of downside on reporters. Reporters are great, but reporters and analysts are two different type of people. In the same way that, pitchers and catchers are both baseball players, but they can't interchange with each other. They're different skill sets. And so we have to be careful about this. Reporters, very left-brain focused, they're logical, sequential, rational, objective. They kind of look at the parts. And there's a lot of value to that. It's a really good thing. But that's not what great analysts are. Great analysts are more like Sherlock Holmes. They use both sides of their brain. They have that logical piece, but they have this creative side. And this creative side is where the magic comes from. They're able to look at lots of different points, data points, and they're able to connect them. They're able to see the connections between all those data points in ways that others just can't. And it's that creative side that is able to pull that together. And by making all those connections is how we start to get these brilliant insights that we really can take and make great analysis from. And we can take great actions on and we can improve our businesses. So it's finding that right type of person. But then what do we do too often? All too often. We hire that analyst and then we turn them into a reporter, right? So we start asking for tons of data and reports. And what happens there? We suck the very life out of these people. And we have to be really careful about that. We have to be careful about not trying to become an amateur analyst ourselves, out there doing it for ourselves. Instead, what we need to do is really ask questions. Why is conversion down on Google paid search? What's the optimal marketing mix to support, the launch of brand X? Or why are return rates growing? These are questions. We ask these questions, we give a little context, the analyst can go away and look at the data and come back and provide us answers. But that's what we've got to do rather than, hey, can you give me this report, give me this set of data, whatever. I'm going to go off and do it on my own. The next thing is we expect the data to be perfect and the analysis to be flawless. Even this barbecue place knows that that's not realistic. And we have to be careful about that. The reality is expectations can be somewhat dangerous. Now, it's not bad to have high expectations, but to expect perfection is not realistic. And unrealistic expectations can be a real problem in any analysis. The reality is, as much data as we have, it's flawed sometimes. And we don't want to sort of tear apart the whole analysis just because there's a little piece of it that's not right that isn't even material to the entire presentation. So a friend of mine, some of you may know Tim Wilson. He writes a blog called Gilligan on Data, as you can see. He sort of looks like Gilligan. But I'll tell you what, his blog is much more like The Professor. I mean, really great stuff in there about analysis and the things he talks about. And he tackled this issue of data and data imperfections. And he had a great post on it. What he said, he was talking about, and he gave this Mark Twain quote. A man with one watch knows what time it is. A man with two watches is never quite sure. And that's true. And the reality is, in our worlds, we are dealing with a sea of watches. All of our data, there's all these different points. And sometimes they don't match perfectly. Omniture might not perfectly match with Google Analytics if you're running them on the same site. Sometimes you could put the Omniture tag on two different spots of the same page and it won't match. That's just the world we live in. But what Tim talked about really is, hey, it's about trends. You've got to kind of look at trends, and you look at how the data changes over time, and that's really where you want to sink in, and that's what you want to work on. And that's how you can get the most out of the data. Any little imperfections here and there aren't really material in that kind of setting. And so that's what we want to look at and understand with the data. Next, we fail to define objectives and state our assumptions. See, I like this cartoon here. Again, the guy says tree. One guy's thinking of this big, gnarly old tree, and the other guy's kind of got the Charlie Brown tree in mind. And if they don't get on the same page about which tree they're talking about, they're never going to get anywhere in the conversation. So it's really important when we set out on these analyses that we're very clear about what are our objectives, what are we trying to do, what assumptions are we making, where are we going, what are the questions we're trying to answer. We need to be very clear about that when we talk to an analyst or we set things off and get a project started. On the flip side of that, the analyst role here is very important to come back and check off against all those. Okay, I understood the objectives. Here's where I came up with this. Here's where I came up with that. Here's the assumptions that I made. We need to be very clear about those things. If we're not, we start to have those disconnects. Next, we want numbers for numbers' sake. So another, like this cartoon too, if I'd known they wanted me to use all this information, I never would ask for it. And that kind of happens all the time too. The reality is we have a ton of numbers. And so we have to be really careful about that. Larry talked yesterday about we can't manage what we don't measure, and that is absolutely true. We also cannot manage everything that we can measure. And we have to remember that too. I like to think about all the data we have and sort of compartmentalize it in 3 different areas. You have your KPIs, your supporting metrics, and then forensics metrics. And KPIs, there shouldn't be a whole lot of those. 5 or 6 really, and those should be tightly tied to the objectives of the business. There shouldn't be too many of those. Very important metrics. We want to find the ones that are really making the difference in how the business grows. Now, supporting metrics are there, and they're really supporting the KPIs. Now, there's a lot more of those, and they should be tightly aligned to the KPIs. But now you're talking about, if conversion is a KPI, then email conversion and Google paid search conversion, those types of things would be supporting metrics. Those are things that individuals within the organization can use to manage and grow and pay attention to, and they support that overall KPI. What's left are the forensics metrics. And, that's just like what we're talking here, CSI or what have you. Now you're talking about all that other stuff. But just like forensics metrics, we don't fingerprint our houses every day, right? In the same way, we can't do that with data. If somebody breaks into our house, we might do some fingerprinting or whatever. If we have a problem with a supporting metric or a KPI, that's the time to dive into the forensics metrics and dig into them. But not have those show up on reports that we're looking at all the day and trying to pretend we're managing, because we can't manage those. So the next is we insist on simplicity, and this is one of my favorites. Like this one, find X. Well, there it is, right there. See, X. And the little thing at the bottom says, the simplest solutions are often the cleverest. They're also usually wrong. And so we have to be careful of this demand for simplicity and try to understand where it's right to have simplicity and where it's not. So I'll give one of my favorite examples. It's this question, right? How likely are you to recommend the business? And it's part of the NPS score, right? And so if you're familiar with that, NPS asks this question on an 11-point scale, and it breaks it into 3 parts. You got your promoters, your passives, and your detractors, and then there's an equation. The net promoter score is the percentage of the promoters minus the percentage of the detractors. Super simple to understand, very simple to understand. But it's got kind of math problems. It's got a number of problems. There's large margins of error. It's taken this big 11-point scale and converted it to a 3-point scale, so that's a problem. There's low precision, low detection of movement. If you see people a lot of people maybe move from a 1 to a 5, that would be pretty big movement, right? But in the context of the score, it's not going to change at all, other than the margin of error, which is bouncing all over the place. So that's a problem. There's interpretation problems. Larry mentioned this a little bit yesterday. Just because someone is not likely to recommend doesn't mean they're actively detracting. So that's a problem. And then it's not very predictive. That's not just me saying that. The Journal of Marketing came out and said, using the industries that Frederick Reichheld, the creator of NPS, cites as exemplars of Net Promoter, the research fails to replicate his assertions regarding the clear superiority of Net Promoter. So he came out and responded to that, and he said, well, all we did was quantify this common sense in a way that made sense to business leaders, the target audience for my book. And he says, these practical leaders have little interest in advanced statistical methods. And I go, man, geez. And then I hear that and I wonder, why is there this concern over statistical methods used in calculating something like this when we don't have that same concern over many other areas? The business leaders he's referring to aren't trying to read through all the code on the websites and everything that puts together the websites of the POS application. When you go to a restaurant, we're not trying to understand all the ingredients in the secret sauce. We just want to know that it's a tasty meal, right? So why do we get so caught up in this particular area on what's simple and what's not and how a thing sort of is generated? A better way to go, of course, is the ACSI. Which, as we know, was created by an economist. We saw him here today. Smart guy, we heard. Smartest guy Larry's ever met. And he created this thing that we've seen really works. But you know what? It's complicated. It uses a partial least square regression analysis. It's complicated as hell, right? But it can be expressed simply. It's a satisfaction score. And so that's simple and that's easy to understand. And the beauty of it is it fits into a model that's also easy to understand. And by the way, a model that really lives up to the elements of fame. Right? It's great. It's focused. There's not much to it. On the left side, we've got a lot that's actionable. We're able to take that satisfaction score and break it down into elements that are actionable and manageable, things that we can work on the site. We know these are things we can change that will drive that satisfaction score. And then the beauty is it's predictive. And we can tie that predictive element to key elements of our business. You know, how likely, as we improve our satisfaction score, are we going to get people to purchase online or offline or whatever those key objectives are for the company? It does all that for us. And it does it in a way that's really simple. It's simple. But there's all that meat behind it that we can really rely on. And it's causal, which is great. Causal is really important because the other thing is correlations are an area that get us into trouble too. Because they seem so simple, right? Let me give you an example. Imagine that we have a ton of data that sleeping with your shoes on is highly correlated with headaches. And not, by the way, is it correlated, it's sequential too. So the sleeping with the shoes happens first, the headaches happen next. Now, if we take a really deep look at it, really statistical methodology, and really kind of dig into this, what we might find is actually there's a third cause of the other two. So, turns out beer waterfalls really do cause sleeping with the shoes on and headaches in the morning. And so that's the advantage of taking a deep look at things. So next, we just want the number. You know, we're talking about things in the future. We just want the number. There's this book called Why Can't You Just Give Me the Number by Patrick Leach that I highly recommend you read, by the way. And what he talks about is, you know, in the future, things are uncertain. We can't know exactly what the number is. We've got to start getting used to probabilities and ranges when we're talking about things in the future because that's actually a lot more accurate than trying to just pick a number. You know, and we see this in other parts of our lives. We have weathermen, right? They're kind of goofy, but a lot of these guys are scientists or meteorologists. And they use highly complex statistical methodologies to come up with what the weather's going to be. But they know better than to tell us exactly what the temperature is or for sure it's going to rain. They tell us things in probabilities and ranges. And that's great because that allows us to know roughly what's going to happen and we can plan for it. We can plan contingencies. And we need to be able to do the same thing in our businesses. It's another book I love called The Flaw of Averages by Sam Savage. And in he's got a quote in there that says, plans based on average assumptions are wrong on average. You know, and this is, we got to be very careful about averages and where we use them and where we don't use them because averages can really be misleading. And he gives an example too. He's got this picture in his book and he says, you know, imagine you have this drunk guy walking down the street, he's walking down the middle of the road and he's kind of swerving around. He says the state of the drunk at his average position, down the center of the line, is alive. But the average state of the drunk is dead. And that's because in this case, you know, a little bit outside of that average, it changes everything. And so we have to be really careful about when we use these and make proper use of them and not just blindly sort of throw out averages all the time. Which kind of takes me to the next thing, that we aren't multilingual in the languages of business and statistics. You know, analysts sometimes aren't aware enough of the business language and what's going there. Business folks are not sometimes, or you know, decision makers are not aware enough of the statistics and what goes behind them, and we need to get better about that. We need to kind of go back and remember to the classes we took in college maybe, and you know, some of these key things like standard deviations and variances and confidence intervals and you know, proper random sample size or proper sample sizes and random samples. These are all things that make a huge difference in the end with statistics. Sometimes I think we learned all these in college, and then as we got further away from it, we just remembered you can believe the numbers without remembering all the nuances that go with it. And so I think it's good to sort of refresh on those. We never want to get into this kind of conversation, you know. Hey, we need to determine the sample size for the product test. How confident and precise do we want the results to be? Well, naturally, 100% confident. So within which margin of error? Would it need to be a very big sample if we need decent precision? If you want 100% certainty, well, we can only afford one. So no worries, we'll be 100% confident with 100% margin of error, right? So you got to be careful about those kind of situations and really understand some of those little nuances. Now I'll tell you, baseball, I love baseball, I love watching baseball, but listening to announcers mangle statistics on baseball drives me absolutely batty. You know, and it's really bad, and I actually worry that people hearing these kind of statistics that you hear when you're watching sports, and especially baseball, actually influences negatively understanding of statistics in the business place. And so we have to be really careful about that. I could do an entire presentation on what a disaster baseball announcers are with statistics. But let's focus on even one, you know, streaks. They're talking about streaks all the time. You imagine this one, you know, Tigers choke down the stretch. And whenever you hear this kind of thing, you inevitably hear something like they've lost 11 of their past 13 games. And, you know, do you ever wonder why they pick those weird numbers like that? Why isn't it, you know, out of 10 games or 20 games or something like that? And you know, it's because they're picking the right sample within there that fits the narrative. not what the data actually says and not a true story of what's going on with the data. And we have to be careful not to do that in our own analysis. I'll give you another example. If I flip a coin 10 times, how many times is it going to be heads? And the right answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know. If I flip it 1,000 times, it's going to be heads about 500 times. But I'll tell you what, within that 1,000 coin flips, I guarantee you I can find 7 in a row, 8, 9, 10, 11 in a row. No problem. I could find those. And if I go and pick that out, what am I telling? The reality is the probability of that coin being heads is 50% no matter what. So we have to really try to understand that and make sure we don't get caught up in those silly things. And again, I would say that better than watching baseball, watch poker on TV. Because you know what? Poker players, they're thinking about probabilities all the time. They're looking at the data in front of them. They're analyzing the situation. They're doing a little competitive analysis. They're looking at other players. They understand their tendencies. And they're taking all that information, and they're making decisions based on the math. And that's pretty awesome. You can really learn about statistics watching poker in ways you won't learn watching baseball. But if you insist on watching baseball, then definitely read Moneyball. Don't watch the movie. Read the book. The book talks a lot about how you can really look at data and understand what the data is really telling you. And it's a really good book, and it really makes you think about baseball totally differently. Now, again, on the flip side, analysts need to understand what's going on with the executives, with the business decision makers, and understand their perspective, their language, be able to speak to their language. It's very important as an analyst to be able to say something that the executive, the decision maker, is going to understand in context. And also understand those decisions that are facing. What is that person facing? What are those decisions? If you understand those decisions right, you can present the right analysis that really allow those decisions to be well informed. So that's also very important. So then next, we expect answers immediately, right? So this real-time data world, we've got data all the time. We need to know now what exactly is going on. Got to know now. And we have to be careful about that. I'll give you an example. I was on the road a while back, and I was watching CNN in my hotel room, and the story comes on, breaking news, and there's a story that there has been shots on the Potomac. The Coast Guard is something going on in the Coast Guard, and the reporter was monitoring, and she heard, you're approaching a Coast Guard security zone. If you don't stop your vessel, you'll be fired upon. Stop your vessel immediately. And so she's like, wow. And she heard shots, so she calls her boss back in the newsroom, and they go on air immediately. And, they drag the Secretary of Homeland Security out to ask her what's going on. And they shut down Reagan National Airport. And then as the facts start to come out, we find, actually, that this was an exercise that the Coast Guard ran 4 times a week. Over and over, they've been running this. She just happened to be monitoring today, and here's this thing. And those shots, by the way, what she actually heard was somebody saying, bang, 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 bang. So, talk about a case where you're wanting to make the data say what you want it to say. So we have to be really careful not to kind of overreact to these types of things and get into that trouble. I worked for a company a while back and that we used to say had the full accelerator, full brake syndrome. When there was a little bit of good data, bam, we're going forward. We've got to make it happen. And then 2 weeks later, a little bit of bad data, slam on the brakes. And that kind of cycle can be a killer. So we have to be really careful about that. And I'll tell you, there's a concept that's so important, I'm not even going to put a goofy slide up about it. And that's this idea of regression to the mean. And what this means really is we have to have a large enough sample size or a long enough time period that we'll see the data regress back to a mean, to a real center. And that will happen with data in any situation. And it's very important, very, very important, that we wait to see that occur before we start reacting to it. And so that's just a concept that I think is incredibly important and very important for all businesses to really pay attention to that and know when that occurs. So the next, we ignore our guts. It's hard to ignore that gut, But sometimes, the reality is when we talk about our gut, we're really talking about a piece of our brain called the amygdala. And this is, sometimes referred to as the lizard brain or the prehistoric brain or the hidden brain, all these things. But really the emotional reactions that we have to things, the quick, immediate reaction to things, are actually our amygdala, this little piece of the brain. And over time, initially that was really an instinct for us to, deal with tigers coming out of the woods or whatever. But over time, we developed the prefrontal cortex. And this is the rational side of our brain. And it's obviously very important. We use that piece of the brain a lot. And it sort of offsets the amygdala sometimes. But sometimes we have to be careful it doesn't over-offset it. That we don't rationalize things we hear and ignore this. If there's someone in our business that's super, super experienced, and we present something and they say, I don't know, that just doesn't feel right to me. We shouldn't ignore that. We should pay attention. We should go back and double check. Could be wrong. That instinct could still be wrong, but very often it's right, and it's worth taking a second look at because there's can be a lot of value coming out of that section of the brain. A couple books that really deal with this that I would highly recommend: Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, How We Decide by Jonah Lehrer, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman. They all talk about this, that part of our brain and how it sort of works for us and doesn't work for us, and when to pay attention and when not. Really, really great books, lots of good reads. So the 11th way that humans kill good analysis is the one that just kills me. We blow the presentation, right? We have this great analysis, great thinking, put all this in there, and when it comes time for the presentation of that data, we blow it and it's all shot. You know, there's a little-known Einstein theory that really great analysis plus really poor presentation equals really crappy analysis. It's kind of how that ends up working out. And so we got to be careful not to fall into that trap. And this is true, by the way, whether it's written or presented live. It can happen in both cases. We have to be really careful. You ever been to a presentation like this where, you know, there's like this whole paragraph on the stage and the guy turns around and reads it? Painful, right? You end up snoozing and the whole thing is lost. It's not good. So we got to be careful of that. Or how about this? You know, you get this big giant thing of tons of numbers, and maybe if you're lucky, they'll circle one number. But even then, what do you do with that? It's so hard to sort of center, and before you know it, it's gone and they're moving on. And so that's a problem. Or you know, I've seen these, just a whole spreadsheet on the screen. You know, what are you supposed to do with that? We need a little pre-editing to be able to deal with that. How about this kind of graph? You know, it's like, what the hell? You know, impossible, right? Or pie charts like this, where you're just like, I don't know, you know. So how does this happen? How does this happen? Well, I'll tell you what. Number one, it happens because of laziness. You know, we just don't take the time to put the presentation together after doing all that work. The other thing is, the reality is, when we're analysts and we're doing all this, we are way more intimate with this data than our audience is. We've spent hours, weeks, days, whatever. We spent a ton of time on this data, and now we're presenting to someone seeing it for the very first time. And we have to remember that. It's really important that we kind of hold their hand through that, and we walk them step by step through what we're seeing. Even in like a sort of simple graph like this, it can be too much. Got to break it down. You know, show kind of one data point where it's going. Maybe draw a trend line on it. And then after you do that and talk through that, then draw the comparison point. Because now we've centered the audience on it, and we can say, okay, here's the story. And you're following the story, and you understand the story. And if people are following the story and sort of trying to figure out what the hell's going on the screen, then you're able to deliver the message. And so that's really, really important. Or I'll go back to my friend Tim again. He did a whole thing on pie charts in his blog, Tim. And he said, you know, a pie chart like this even is hard to see. And he said, really, pie charts, more than 2 or 3 data points, forget it. It's not really legible. Instead, you know, go to like a horizontal bar chart. It's much easier. The labels fit in. You can clearly see where everything is. You can still deliver the same message. In fact, you can deliver the message much better, and people can follow what's going on. So it's choosing the right chart sometimes is really important. Another book I'd recommend, Presentation Zen. Great book on how to give great presentations. Really talks about how to filter things down, what kind of visuals to use. So that can really help. So, you know, as we go through and think about all the analysis, we can kind of stop killing the good analysis. And if we can do that, then we can achieve that fame. We can have hordes of adoring fans, you know. Maybe not a lot of teenage girls. Maybe these guys. But you know what? That ain't bad, right? So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.